Bienvenidas a todas las personas. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Estamos viendo cómo están ingresando las personas participantes. Les agradecemos por estar aquí en este espacio.
And as we welcome folks, also want to thank and welcome our Spanish interpreter, Denise. Denise, curious if you want to talk a little bit about how folks can access the webinar in Spanish.
Y al darles la bienvenida, también les daremos las instrucciones para la interpretación al español. We do have language interpretation available to all those persons who are monolingual, whether speaking English or Spanish, must choose a language channel. To access the language interpretation, after these instructions, you will be able to click on a globe icon that will say interpretation at the bottom of your screen. You will select your preferred language, English or Spanish. If you are on your phone or tablet, you will tap the screen to activate the buttons at the bottom of the screen, select the circle with the 3 dots, then select interpretation and your language of preference. If the original audio in the background is too distracting and you would like to hear only the interpreter's voice, you may select mute original audio. Please remember to speak slowly and clearly only in the language you have selected. Tenemos interpretación al español disponible el día de hoy. Todas las personas monolingües, ya sea que hablen inglés o español, deberán seleccionar un canal de idioma. Para acceder a la interpretación, después de estas instrucciones, podrán seleccionar el icono del globo que aparecerá al fondo de la pantalla. De la lista que saldrá, seleccionará su idioma preferido, inglés o español. Si está en su teléfono o tableta, toque su pantalla para activar los botones al fondo de la misma. Seleccione los 3 puntos, luego seleccione interpretación y su idioma de preferencia. Si le distrae demasiado escuchar el audio original en el trasfondo y quiere escuchar solamente la voz de las intérpretes, puede seleccionar la opción que dice Mute Original Audio. Favor de hablar lenta y de manera clara solamente en el idioma que ha seleccionado. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Sorry, Carly, please.
No, I was just going to invite Teo if you'd like to hop on and share with folks how they can access the live captions.
Yes, definitely. So if you're needing closed captioning today, or if you just want to follow along with subtitles or to see the full transcript, you can click, there should be a button at the bottom that says live transcript or captions, and it will give you the option to show subtitles or hide subtitles at any point. You can toggle between them.
Thank you so much, Teo. Thank you so much, Denise. Welcome, everybody. My name is Carly Romero. I'm a program manager at NewMexicoWomen.org. Here with our panelists today and our co-host Ian Esquivel. And we will do full bios and introductions in just a second, but I wanted to just take an opportunity to provide a little bit of context for NewMexicoWomen.org and the Healthy Masculinities collaborative and community of practice from which this webinar originates. So NewMexicoWomen.org is the only fund of its kind in New Mexico that works to advance opportunities for women, girls, and gender expansive folks statewide to lead self-sufficient, healthy, and empowered lives. We do this through 3 key program areas: grant making, research, and training and education, with a strategy centered around gender justice and healing. And in 2017, NewMexicoWomen.org published a community-based research project based on dialogues from across the state, where we really heard a deep need and desire for opportunities to engage men, particularly cis men, in gender justice efforts. We simply cannot solve patriarchy and violence without men. And this led us to form the New Mexico Healthy Masculinities Collaborative in 2018 with Tewa Women United, Together for Brothers, the New Mexico Health Equity Partnership, and the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. And shortly thereafter, Ian joined us as a facilitator, Ian Esquivel, to help steward this shared body of work. And Ian, maybe you can share a little bit about your experience, the toolkit, if you don't mind, and our process around that and why you're here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carly. Welcome, everybody. I had the good fortune to join the Healthy Masculinities Collaborative a few years ago and have really enjoyed the work. It's work that's close to my heart. As Carly mentioned, I think it's imperative work for men to do. As cisgendered heterosexual man, I think I play an important role, as do so many different people in the space. And so feel lucky to have built relationships with a number of the panelists, with Carly, Fatima, Teo, others who have done the work, and acknowledging that there's lots of good work happening across our state. The ability to bring some folks together through a community of practice to develop a toolkit has been very exciting for me. And so we put together a toolkit a couple years ago, and we're in the process of updating that toolkit in response to what we've learned from community. I think there's a real hunger to have these conversations, and it's not always the easiest thing to talk about. And so we look to folks who do this work day in and day out to advise and guide what some of their practices and activities have been to make some of these conversations more accessible. So excited about that. I think this webinar series is another effort in that stream. How are we engaging with folks? How are we creating space? Yeah, anything else you would add, Carly?
No, thank you, Ian. I just want to just name a few sort of housekeeping pieces, which is that we'll be spotlighting speakers on Zoom today, muting and turning off cameras for others. We invite everybody to share comments and questions in the chat. And then we also have a Q&A little blurb down here where you can particularly share questions that you want panelists to consider answering toward the end of the conversation. I'm going to pass it back to you, Ian, before we kind of move into building our context for the conversation today and introducing our guests.
Great. Thank you, Carly. So I hope folks are having an okay time accessing interpretation. Just want to be mindful of notes that are happening on the webinar chat. And please let us know if there's any challenges you all might be having. It's my good fortune to introduce some of our panelists. And so I appreciate Fatima and Teo, who've been sharing Carly and my bio there in the chat. I'm going to read off the bios of our guests today. And again, thank you all for joining us. First bio of Adrien Lawyer. Adrien is the Director of Education at the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. He co-founded TGRC-NM in 2008 with Zane Stevens to be a clearinghouse of service provision, education, and advocacy for the transgender community in New Mexico. He has facilitated over 3,500 transgender cultural fluency training sessions throughout New Mexico, including training every correctional facility in the state, numerous district attorney offices, police departments, public and private schools, healthcare and social services facilities, and countless businesses, nonprofits, and other entities. Adrien has led successful advocacy efforts for model transgender student policies, gender-neutral restrooms, trans inclusion in social service facilities, statewide bullying prevention, and updating the law that governs birth certificate gender marker change. On a national level, Adrien presents and consults on many issues impacting the trans community, including TGRC as a successful model for local service provision. He has been recognized with the Jose Saria Into the Light Award for Community Service and the Vincent R. Johnson Model of Hope Award for LGBTQ role models. In 2019, Adrien won the Advocacy and Action Professional Innovation in Victim Service Award presented by the New Mexico Crime Victims Reparation Commission. Adrien is a trans man and father. In his spare time, he enjoys playing guitar with a band named Sue. So welcome, Adrien. Thank you for being with us. We are also joined by Michael Trimm, the TGRC Executive Director. Michael joined TGRCM in November 2020 as Director of Operations and was promoted in February 2022 to Executive Director of Services and Administration. Originally from Ohio and with 8 siblings, Michael now calls the Southwest region home and sought the opportunity to join the Center to be part of uplifting, encouraging, and empowering transgender and gender nonconforming people. It is rare to find an organization dedicated to serving and empowering transgender and gender nonconforming people that is led by transgender and gender nonconforming people with the ability to directly impact the lives of the community in a positive way. So thank you, Michael, for being with us. And our third guest, Marshall Martinez, is the Equality New Mexico Executive Director. Marshall is an organizer and has been a political strategist for multiple candidates and organizations, from fighting climate change with the League of Conservation Voters to working for fair pay and safe working conditions with AFSCME, the Public Employee Labor Union. All personal fights, because like all of us, he has lived a multi-issue life. Born and raised in Alamogordo, New Mexico, to a working class family and a group of particularly strong women, and a few great men too. In high school, Marshall worked to educate young people about safer sex. Marshall's policy expertise focuses on gender and sexuality, bodily autonomy, and reproductive and sexual health care. Marshall also prides himself on his skill set for navigating attacks against our values in ways that build power for the communities being attacked rather than just winning the short-term fight. Marshall strongly believes in the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So thank you all three for being with us today.
Yes, thank you. Gosh, what a powerhouse of panelists. Thank you so much for those introductions, Ian. I'm just going to offer a little sort of context for our conversation today, like why healthy masculinities? Why are we talking about queer and trans-affirming parenting in the context of healthy masculinities? And then a little sort of data to set the table around the experience of queer and trans children and youth in New Mexico. So firstly, patriarchy creates and reproduces a gender binary, or the belief that there are two and only two genders, and those outside of that binary are then invisibilized or marked by patriarchy as an aberration. And central to the ideation of the gender binary are traits and behaviors generalized as masculine that are celebrated and normalized, while quote unquote feminine traits and behaviors are classified as distinct from and often inferior to men and masculinity. Within current dominant narratives, the quote unquote ideal masculinity is cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied, and wealthy, placing men of color, trans and gay men, disabled men, poor and working class men, cis and trans women, and all other genders as less than, particularly where the lesser identities intersect. And this quote unquote ideal masculinity is usually expressed in opposition to femininity and in opposition to queerness. Understanding and unpacking how we are socialized around gender is really essential in our learning of healthy and positive masculinities. And as so much of how we relate to gender is learned and internalized in childhood, having these conversations with parents and caregivers is really critical. So it's really great that we're here to talk about this today. In relation to queer and trans children and youth, just a little bit of data. I am going to be like sort of reeling off data points, so try to stay with me if you can for the next few minutes here. Research reflects that for trans and gender nonconforming children and youth, gender affirming behavior on the part of parents and other adults like teachers and grandparents greatly improves mental health and well-being among young people. The opposite is also true. Unfortunately, transgender children are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and are at greater risk of substance misuse and being unhoused when their immediate caregivers are hostile or reject them. It's really important to know, and quite alarming, that research finds that transgender youth are at greater risk of suicide compared to their non-transgender peers as a result of rejection, bullying, and other victimization. And I want to just uplift here that the suicide hotline is 988 if anyone listening is in crisis, and the trans lifeline can be reached at 1-877-565-8860, and that information should be in the chat available to you. So data from a 2021 national survey on LGBTQ youth mental health revealed that overall 28% of LGBTQ youth reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability at some point in their lives, with transgender and non-binary youth being most heavily impacted. And when we look at the New Mexico data, it's even more devastating. So housing insecurity is a particular concern in New Mexico, with an estimated 40 to 56% of our LGBTQ youth statewide experiencing housing insecurity. Most New Mexican LGBTQ plus students experience bullying, and the majority of those students have experienced verbal harassment based on sexual orientation, gender, and gender expression, with around 1/4 of LGBTQ plus students having experienced physical harassment based on sexual orientation, gender, and gender expression. Among LGBTQ plus youth, 70% experience anxiety and 57% experience depression, with even higher rates among transgender and non-binary youth. And finally, this is really important, going back to that initial research that tells us that family has a really can have a really high impact, as well as adult role models, on the well-being of our LGBTQ plus youth. 73% of New Mexican LGBTQ plus youth in New Mexico express low to moderate support from their family. So these are some really grave and significant statistics, and I'm imagining most of the people joining us today are parents, maybe aunties and uncles, grandparents, or others that care for young people in some way, or perhaps intend to in the future. And the good news is that there are wonderful resources in our communities for understanding how to support young people to feel loved and accepted for who they are, as they are, and to be a pillar of safety in their journeys. Two of those incredible resources in our state are with us today. So the Transgender Resource Center for New Mexico offers peer support groups for trans and gender variant youth, as well as for parents and families, among a plethora of other services that they provide. And their website should be available to you in the chat if you'd like to check them out and learn more. And then Equality New Mexico, also here to share their wisdom, Marshall, with us today, has played a central role in passing legislation to make our state safer for New Mexico's LGBTQIA plus community members. So thank you all so much for your incredible work in our communities. I think, unfortunately, those statistics highlighted just how important your presence and your commitment is. And we want to allow you to sort of introduce yourselves, if you will, with a little bit of storytelling. So whoever wants to go first is welcome to jump in. And we just have a couple questions. What are your guiding principles and values as a parent? Or what guiding principles and values do you encourage for queer and trans affirming parents?
I know it's awkward Zoom pause. I mean, this is such a hard thing to distill, you realize your values so much as you parent, I think, and your kids will tell you what they are more than you can articulate them a lot of times. But I think, in line with what we're talking about today, with my now 19-year-old kiddo, trying not to enforce gender norms and stereotypes with them was a really big deal for me. And I know that I did it because these things are so unconscious. They're so, we're so deeply acculturated around it that it comes out without our knowing. But I tried to bring consciousness to that and to really not push some of the dominant US gender norms and stereotypes on my kid from really early childhood all the way up. Just even in simple terms of wanting them to feel their emotions, be able to name and talk about their emotions, be able to cry and feel bad, even if people are around, a lot of stuff that wasn't the norm for me and my brother. I'll be 54 next week. And my brother's 2 years younger, and for us, we definitely were not encouraged to feel our feelings, or certainly not express them. And so that was a challenge for me, even as a dad. But I was really committed to wanting my kiddo to have that access to their own emotional reality, and to be able to connect around it as well with others.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, Adrien, and I will confess I am not a parent. But I mean, one of the things that I think the thing that I think about, and I think about my parents and my family in the community where I grew up, rural, relatively conservative community in southern New Mexico. I don't know that I could have a conversation with my parents about the gender binary or about gender stereotypes or about this sort of dominant cultural expectation, right? But the conversation I had with my parents as an adult after I came out and, was really able to think through some of this stuff was that until I came out, they were attempting to fit me into a box that I clearly didn't fit in, and they could see that. And I think when I think about sort of stepping away from the academic or progressive community's understanding of this stuff and thinking about my parents and their understanding, and not to sell them short, they are brilliant people, but they are not academics, they're not philosophers, right? I think being able to just say to them, and now to my peers who are parents, like, you'll know who your kid is from the very beginning. And if your starting point is parent the child in front of me rather than parent the child that someone else told me I would or should have, you're probably already starting from a really great place, right? I, unsurprisingly, was highly emotional, and I cried a lot, and my feelings were often very hurt, and I felt left out, and none of those things have changed. And my parents thought, like, that's not what boys do, and so they tried to push me not to be that. And I think that the solution would have been to be like, Marshall gets his feelings hurt easily, and so sometimes we'll just insulate him from that, or we'll tell him, don't get your feelings hurt about this. Your cousin wasn't trying to be, mean or spiteful or whatever. You can't take it personally. And if you need to go be by yourself for a little while, go do that. Right. And so I think for me, I sort of frame that in just in that sort of mindset of like, parent the kid in front of you as they come to you.
Yeah, I would kind of agree and fall kind of in line with Adrien and Marshall on this particular topic. I'm a dad of 4, and my kiddos are now mostly adults. My youngest is 15, and parenting the children that show up is so much that has been kind of a reminder in the back of my head as well, instead of trying to push my thoughts, dreams, ideas for that child onto them. So taking these kiddos as they come. Additionally, having grace for ourselves as parents, as these special adults in the life of young people. We don't know what we don't know. And now once we learn something new, then we need to apply it. Like, you just can't be like, oh, I learned something new, but I'm just not going to use it. Like that's not really a thing, right? But having grace for ourselves and understanding that, like Adrien said, all of these like gender norms and stereotypes, these things feel so natural because, our parents did them to us and their parents did it to them, and so on and so forth. Right. So as we learn new information, giving ourselves grace for all the times that we feel like we messed our kids up, or like we tried to force them into boxes that perhaps they don't belong in. And moving forward with new information and new skills and new ways of interacting with our young people.
Thank you all for sharing some of your story with us. We're going to continue in that vein and go a little bit deeper. And I appreciate I think we're coming at these conversations from a couple of levels. And folks on this call have a lot of experience and a lot of expertise. And I also think, Marshall, to your point, like there isn't one way to do it. So if people join this call thinking like, what's the only path to rear our children, we're learning together. And there's different things for different children, but I do think we can learn from each other's experiences, whether we're parents ourselves or whether we received parenting in an affirming way that felt different. And so we want to be careful not to blast people in our lives or people who aren't doing it right, and acknowledge that like we all have a lot to learn. As we were preparing for this, Carly and I had a lot of conversations. We're both parents. I'm a father to a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, and I want to show up the best I can for them. And there's lots of things I don't know how to do. And there's lots of things that they're going to learn about themselves that's going to push me to question, well, how was I reared? And how did I see people show up with kind, caring parenting in a meaningful way? So maybe the next question for our panelists, invite you to pass the mic, invite you to say, no, I'm going to skip that one, whatever feels best for you. Continuing with the storytelling, I'm wondering if you had supportive father figures in your life as you were growing up. And if so, how did those father figures express positive parenting? How did they express healthy masculinity in a way that supported you? And then the flip side, if these father figures didn't necessarily support you in the ways you needed, let's see here. What adults in your life did support you and meet you where you were? What behaviors were affirmative? So I think, if there are ways that we can learn from folks in terms of what worked, and maybe less about here's not the way to do it, and more about here's how we had some of our needs met through that parenting, specifically through fathering, from a coach, from a teacher, from a neighbor. So curious, I know that was a lot of information in the question, but curious if there's something that came out for you.
I don't know why I got super excited to like talk about the dad stuff. Go figure. My therapist is still out on maternity leave, so apologies in advance. I feel fortunate that I grew up in 2 different households. I had my mom and my stepdad, and then I had my dad and my stepmom. And growing up, I didn't have a great relationship with my father, but my stepdad pretty much stepped in from day one. I was 3 years old, and he came into my life at that point in time and has been here ever since. And the juxtaposition of the way that these 2 men interacted with me in my formative years as a young person, one was really positive and one was not. So I got to see the type of man that I wanted to be from my stepdad and the type of person maybe I didn't want to be from my father. And as I matured, and when I came out at 18, 19 years old, my father had already started to make some significant changes in his life, and he became watching his growth and his evolution and in his manhood. We kind of started to mature in our own manhood around the same time. So it was kind of like my dad and I got to become the men that we are today together, which was kind of cool. And my stepdad actually became a support for both of us during that time period. So I have like this kind of weird amalgamation of like manhood and fatherhood in my life, but I definitely wouldn't trade it for anything. And both of these men are still in my life, super supportive, even embarrassingly so in some instances, for sure. And I'm happy to have these sorts of examples to share with my children and with my godchildren and other young people in my life.
I love that. And I think also unsurprising, like I think I when I think about this question, first and foremost, I just always think about how many of us were raised in these non-traditional families, which still seem to be the like model that's held up all over the place. And I don't know anybody who just grew up with like the same mom and dad from birth all the way through to adulthood. But so I also, my parents split and got remarried when I was really young. So I was raised with my mom and my stepdad, who I spent the vast majority of my time, and then my stepmom. And there are lots of complications in those relationships, right? What I will say is that neither my dad nor my stepdad were particularly great about being affirming and accepting of their queer kid until I came out. And the lesson here for me, I mean, my stepdad, who I spent the majority of my time with, right, like a boxer and a race car driver, and worked in construction, and like that was the path he saw for boys in his life, and that was the kind of father that was the kind of son he was trying to make me into. And the day I told him like I'm gay, it was so instant. Like, I mean, you could see like movement in his eyes of this response of like, wow, I've been trying to make you somebody you're not. And there's a lot about the stereotypes of masculinity and queerness and all of those things to unpack there. But the second I told him, honestly, like, this is who I am, all of that changed, right? And so what I think about is that in the last, however many years it's been since I was 16 and came out to my stepdad, his response has just been like, I have this queer son and he's amazing and he's a drag queen and I go to his drag shows, and I've gone to pride parades and I hate them because they're in the middle of the summer and they're in the middle of the heat, and why do people do that? But I'm there for my son, right? Like, that's just the kind of affirming, amazing person. I think back to a few years ago when I found it in myself to finally start putting color on my nails after years of getting manicures and being like, don't put color on my nails, that's a step too far for me. I went home with these like bright rainbow painted nails, and my stepdad just looked at them and was like, like, no commentary, just like, this was the acceptance that I had needed as a child. And so I don't want to focus on, the struggle that I had as a young person not having that, but I will say this sort of takes me back to what I said about like parent the kid in front of you. And I think they should have seen much earlier, but in their defense, the second I told them who I was, they changed everything about the way they parented. And that was true of my father as well. I just didn't spend as much time with him, and I still don't spend as much time with him. And that's a different panel of conversation and a different list of complications. But the way they became affirming parents of me as a teenager and as an adult was really life-changing for me, and I think set me on a very different path just in time for me to move out and start to try to be my own grown-up, though it took a few years to accomplish that, I think.
I never find myself not wanting to say something, but for me that was such a missing experience. Like I definitely was more focused on like literary examples. I was a really avid reader as a kid, to kind of a dissociative habit probably. And so I read about men that I admired or found qualities in TV characters and stuff like that, movie characters. So I looked for role models that were men in other places more than I did in my immediate surroundings or in my family.
Thank you, Adrien. I think that's like so real, right? Like, just to name that, I think that's an experience for so many people. And I also love that we have some really beautiful, positive, like, I love that we have the range here just to like reflect what's real in people's lives. And I think, Michael, like, I just feel really moved by you sharing about how you and your father evolved in your like manhood at a similar time and were supported by your stepfather. I think that's such an incredible, that just feels really powerful and like warm and caring. And I feel very moved by that. So thank you for sharing that. And then Marshall, I want to speak to something you said about like, there's so much to unpack about masculinities and queerness. because I think that one thing like we didn't touch upon that I want to name in like this, our conception of healthy masculinities as a collaborative or like a community of practice, like we're this multi-gendered statewide group that's been doing this work. And now we're up to like 17 organizations, and we're multi-gendered intentionally. And we use masculinities in the plural intentionally because there's so many ways to enact or embody masculinities and or femininities, right? There's just so many different ways to do that in both like positive and negative sort of ways, or with positive and negative behaviors. And then also like, I think it's really important to just name that this conversation is held in a pedagogy of love and like a space of love and care, and not a space of like indictment of traditional masculinity, but a recognition that it is like traditionally like harmful, maybe unconscious masculine behaviors are very much shaped by society. Which goes back to the significance, Adrien, of like, yeah, I pulled from the resources that were like around me. I didn't have that in my family, but like there were some resources available in society that you were able to like pull from. And that's just really important to hear, and super, super resourceful. Ian, I'm going to pass it off to you for the next question.
Thank you, Carly. One of the things we try to do with the toolkit is contextualize this thinking in this conversation within New Mexico, because I think culture is so important to who we are and how we're reared and how we parent. So I wonder if each one of you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and what your culture teaches about queer and trans-affirming parenting.
So I'm happy to kick us off, and as with all of this, like it's kind of complex and layered, right? So I spent the vast majority of my time with the white side of my family in Alamogordo, and when people ask like the culture, I say redneck, which is, I say affectionately, and I mean that. I grew up going to rodeos and listening to classic rock and country music, and like, you know, beer cans and tobacco products in the backyard, and like big barbecues and stuff. And what that teaches about masculinity, I think, are all the things that come to mind with that. And what I think existed, at least in my family and sort of culturally in that space, was this unending desire to love and protect your children, which did kind of trump all of those other sort of values or expectations. And so, you know, it didn't stop my stepdad from trying to convince me that I should, you know, be boxing with my cousins, and that I should like have this desire to be in really fast vehicles, and, you know, all of these things, that I should want to be outside and get dirty when I wanted to like help my mom cook and things like that. Like those were the expectations. And when the thing that sticks with me is that whenever anyone who wasn't in my immediate family pointed out those differences between me and the culture, the men in my family, my stepdad and my uncles, were the first people to step between me and whoever it was that was picking on, attacking, you know, whatever, to be like, I may agree with you, but you ain't gonna talk to my kid this way. Like this space will be safe for my child. And I may reinforce what you're saying when we get home, but that's on me as a parent. That is not you externally, to make my kid feel poorly, right? And then the less time for sure, but my dad's side of the family are Chicano, though they would say Hispanic. They're like borderland, multi-generational New Mexican families, very Catholic. And I don't know that I could sort of identify what that cultural experience around masculinity was. The thing about that family, and it took my dad a while to sort of come around, but the other men in my family were like, it was obvious. I mean, I had like 100 cousins, right? Like my grandparents each had like 13 siblings. So we had hundreds of cousins. There were queer people in every generation, right? Like, and they were obviously queer, because when you've got 20 of them, at least one is going to be like, no, I'm going to show up the way I am. And so I don't know that there was any sort of real enforcement or reinforcement around those values. But despite the external perception of my family and of Chicano families in southern New Mexico, they really are more mine was very much more matriarchal than patriarchal. Um, and like again, my grandma, like she ran stuff hard with that wooden spoon in her hand and was unafraid to use it on anybody. And that meant that all of her grandchildren were happy. If one of her grandchildren was crying, it had better be because they hurt themselves unintentionally, or if you were responsible for it emotionally or physically, you better be running from my grandma, right? And she was just so protective of all of us that I think I had uncles who wanted to sort of reinforce that traditional masculinity mindset. And I think they just knew that my grandma would be between them and not just myself, but my other sort of obviously queer cousins from a very young age. And so culturally, I think I benefited from this protect first mindset, that kind of insulated me from some of the harms. And I know that was a very privileged upbringing, even in those spaces, right? Like I have queer friends, queer peers from both of those sort of spaces that did not have that same level of love and protection that I benefited from.
I actually had a somewhat similar experience growing up. Also, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which, if you know geography, it's basically Kentucky. I could walk to Kentucky from 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 my house. So we had a very strange mix of redneck and quote unquote ghetto. Um, and all of these sorts of things, right? And um I grew up dirt poor in the projects in downtown Cincinnati, and then later the alleged suburbs of Cincinnati. And I grew up in a very religious household. I'm a preacher's kid, and um I think the biggest thing that kind of stood out was that I was a kid that was different, very obviously different, even quote unquote tomboy, if you will. And maybe there were other people outside of our immediate family that had things to say and things to comment on, but they weren't allowed. Now, my parents, they could say whatever, and sometimes they did. Um, but there was definitely like this atmosphere that we love our kid, even if we don't understand our kid, and we're gonna do our damnedest to uh, protect them and love them and nurture them. And that's something that was really poignant. And even when I came out as a trans person, my dad, the very first thing that he said to me was, I do not get it. I don't understand anything about this. I don't understand it. But I don't have to understand it to love you or respect you. And that was that. And we just happened to be at like this like multi-family picnic sort of thing, and somebody else overheard, and they were like, well, I don't like that. My dad was like, I'll kick your ass, like don't talk to my kid like that. And I literally just came out to him 5 minutes before that, right? So I feel very fortunate that I had a family that was supportive of me, even in those times where they had no idea what really to do. They led with, you're our kid, you're our relative, and we'll try to figure this out. And the figure it out part sometimes took much longer than I would have personally liked. Um, but yeah, I'll stop there.
I've been in New Mexico since 1995. So I've lived here a long time, and my kiddo was born and raised here, which I think was really helpful to us in terms of trying to really live in our parenting values as we were raising them, for sure. But I come from the southeastern part of the United States, mainly Jackson, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. And my story, you know, I was born in 1970. So by the time I was 15, people thought I was supposed to stop being a tomboy. And I'd never heard of a trans man or knew that there was such a thing as a trans man. So at that age and in that era, 1985 or so, I came out for the first time as a lesbian. And I lived as what we called a butch lesbian in my cohort. You know, I don't know if people use that term now or not, but we did. And I was a butch lesbian for about 19 years before I was finally able to get my courage up to take those first medical steps, to actualize myself. And that was actually, interestingly, about I had my top surgery right before my kiddo was born, and I started on testosterone therapy right after they were born. Because for me, that was a really crystalline experience about needing to be the person that I really was. If I was going to be an embodied and authentic parent, then I had to have my child see me the way I saw myself and really be who I knew I was supposed to be in the world. So their coming was a great, like, that was, those things really dovetail in my mind when I think about them. They were really important. It was an important moment. Little did I know I was launching myself into male puberty with a baby 6 months old, and that was probably not a great idea. But we all got through it one way or another. And to the question, I would just say, you know, the South is full of queer and trans people, artistic people, creative people, defiantly progressive people. You know, the idea that the South is one thing is ignorant and untrue. And there are so many different kinds of people and cultures and subcultures that exist all throughout the American Southeast. And having said that, I think the cultural stereotyping that we hear about that region is very true. I felt that the gender norms and stereotypes were even heavier and more restrictive there than when I moved out here. And I moved out here with 3 other lesbians. We were in I had a partner at the time, and me and my partner and 2 other women who were partners moved here together as roommates. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful in any way, but for us, when we got here in 1995, we kept walking up to women that we thought were gay, and they were just real outdoorsy. You know, it was like they were just really like Western women that weren't wearing makeup and were wearing chacos and stuff. And in Tallahassee, Florida, where we were coming from, that would have meant that you were gay. Like, that would have meant you were a lesbian, you know? And here it just didn't mean that at all. It was just that the gender expression even was much broader than we found in the South, where people, those expectations lay so heavy on people. When I was first coming out as gay in 1985, I had friends who literally were having cotillions, if people know what that is, which is like debuting into society, you know, being a debutante. And that was a real thing still, even in the 80s, among people that I was, in peer groups with, for sure. So it was hard. To me, being from there and living there was a really additional tough layer to being a trans kid in an era where we didn't have awareness or vocabulary about trans people in the same way. And that was already so hard, you know, but being in the South would definitely added a layer, I think. And moving out here felt like, again, a big part of being more liberated about being able to be who I was, being able to see other people like me, and then actually being able to start that conversation and discovery around transgender people, transmasculine people, and finding myself in that language. And in that like I finally read Stone Butch Blues when I moved out here. It was right around when it was published, and that was probably the moment when I realized I was really trans and understood more what that meant and knew that there were other people like me. And so that was amazing. So for me, New Mexico's always been, a little bit better about some of this stuff than where I grew up, for sure.
Thank you all. A little bit of transparent facilitation. Carly, I know we're seeing some questions coming in. We're about halfway through our time together, so thank you all for being with us. I'm curious, Carly, if you feel okay to maybe move into some Q&A. And so Adrien, Michael, Marshall, if you're okay with that, we have some questions we've developed before, and I know we have 28 people who are participating in this webinar, and so want to make sure if there's some curiosity that those folks have a chance to learn from your wisdom. I'm not sure if everyone has a chance to see what's in the chat, but I think this was maybe similar to a question we received as folks signed up. So don't know if Adrien, Michael, Marshall, you have any thoughts for the individual who is talking about being an expectant parent, and how to move into navigating, what's the gender or sex of your child, and how to be in that space in an affirming and open way.
Sure. So this was sent just to us, so I'll just kind of sum it up. And this person is expecting and wants some books, resources, stories, perspective on raising this child without some of those gendered expectations, stereotypes, etc., and what navigating that looks like. So one, congratulations on this new baby that is coming soon. And two, I think it's super courageous to kind of buck tradition and try to raise this child as the baby that they are without inundating all of these expectations based off of our perception of what this child's gender is based off of their sex that they'll be inevitably designated at birth. I think it's going to take a lot of backbone on you and your partner's part, because I think even if we make those decisions, other people sometimes just can't conceptualize what it is to not immediately gender a baby or a child, right? If you've tried to find gender neutral clothing, it's all ugly. It's all like brown or like mustard yellow or like sad green, not even vibrant green, but like sad green, right? So if you can find really cute kind of gender neutral clothing, that's a really great start. Introducing your child by their name only, it's going to freak people out. So you're just going to have to kind of roll with it. Folks are going to keep asking you, well, what is it? What is it? Is this a boy? Is this a girl? You're like, oh, this is my baby, so-and-so. This is my baby, Jojo. And people are like, okay, and is Jojo a girl or a boy? Jojo is my baby. So, just kind of preparing yourself for those sorts of things and really staying rooted and grounded in the choice that y'all are making, right? And then as, baby X grows and starts to identify who they are in a way that y'all can understand, then maybe shifting one way or the other, or however that looks for you and for your family. It looks like some stuff has been thrown in the chat as well, so I will stop there.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate those tips. I have a 1.5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I was in this question recently, actually, and I had a conversation with Adrien, just sort of spontaneously about this. So I wanted also to invite Adrien what your experience was and a little bit of what we talked about, which felt like a little bit of a middle ground as well, because I know certain members of our family are super involved in childcare, and they are super, super attached to gender expression, and actually just like dying to have a little girl. And I have 2 female babies. So, it's interesting navigating it. In my family, I know one of the things that I do is I make sure that like all pronouns are used in our house, as like a really what feels like a simple practice for my children, just like a little thing that I do. And then Adrien, I wanted to invite you into the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think I was telling you a little bit about our experience, because I'm a transgender advocate, although I wasn't when my kiddo was born. And that was almost 20 years ago now. That was close to 20 years ago now. My kid will be 20 on Halloween. Isn't that a funny birthday to have? The unofficial trans holiday of the world is my kid's birthday. And so way back in 2004, when they were born, we didn't know that they were non-binary. We had no idea. We knew what genitals they had. We knew enough to know. I knew that I was a trans person, even though I wasn't, I was still in process for myself. So we knew enough to be open-ended with our expectations around gender, even though we knew about biological sex. But for me at that time, I didn't feel that I had the wherewithal to like fight this amazing fight, you know? And I love like what Michael's saying, to adhere to your principles about this is absolutely one of the avenues to take, and just to never give in, and, you know, always be thoughtful and have conversation every single time this comes up. For me, I knew that my child would tell me more about themselves as they got older and older. And so when they were pre-verbal, I just went ahead and bought what were called boy clothes a lot of times. I didn't seek them out. I didn't go for like that. Like, it wasn't about like, I'm a guy kind of clothes, or putting a little fake beard on the baby or anything. But I got gender neutral clothes when we could get them. We got cute things that weren't gendered when we could find them, but we didn't fight it. We didn't fight it with every ounce of strength that we had. We called the baby he at the time. We put clothes on him that were marketed for boys. We allowed people to do that, you know, with some limitation. Like, we didn't tell people they couldn't buy certain toys or clothing or gifts for the baby at that time. And we just knew that we would step in and really advocate for the child if they said, hey, I'm a girl. You know, by the time our child was 4 or 5 years old, you know, if they started to come out as a trans person and say, I'm really not a boy, I don't want to be treated this way, then we could really intervene and advocate with and for the child. But prior to that time, I don't know. I felt like it was, especially 20 years ago, it felt like sometimes a battle not worth fighting. And when you talk to me about your family situation, I just know that for a lot of people, we want our kids to be raised in the community of our families as well. And that can mean having to find a little bit of a middle path sometimes around this stuff. It doesn't mean, I think, that you have to give up your principles about any of this to let a child wear a blue shirt that says grandma's favorite boy or whatever on it, you know. Like, I just think that there's varying degrees of all of this, and in a family where we're being intentional and thoughtful about not engaging in restrictive and harmful gender stereotypes and norms with our babies and kids, the rest of that stuff is more like decoration. You know, if we're making sure our little girls are engaging with STEM and spatial toys, and we're making sure that our little boys are growing up to be sweet and caring dads and have great emotional skills and communication skills, to me, whether you put a little boy hat or a little girl hat on them is like, that's not what's going to do anything to them in the end. It's much more about our culture and our society and the way these gender norms cause so much harm overall. So I picked and chose as a parent, and a trans parent of, it turned out, a non-binary adult. So we made those choices, and our child still felt that they were able to come out and be who they are and be non-binary. So for me, there was a little bit more compromise, and I certainly think about that as also being part of the era. But I think even now, I certainly wouldn't be judgmental of somebody who accepts a Christmas gift graciously instead of being like, in your face, I don't want boy stuff, you know? Like, I understand the impulse to want to be in a loving relationship with your family and to have your children also be exposed to family who may not be ready for all of this change right now. You know, if we don't stay in loving relationship with them, how can we help them to come closer to these ideas too, right?
I love that, Adrien, and I think as not a parent and not a trans person, but I like often, I mean, you know, I started seeing my therapist and doing all this stuff, and my stepdad was so upset about the possibility that he had done something harmful in my life, right? So every time I went home to visit for a few years, he was like, are you sure I didn't do something awful? I'm sure I said. And ultimately I was able to say to my stepdad, like, I'm sure you probably did say something really hurtful to me at some point. I don't remember what those things are. What I remember is that you protected me. What I remember is that you listened to me and heard me when I told you who I was. And I think that, like, all four of my parents screwed up a lot of things, right? Like, they screwed up a lot of things. And I think every parent screws up a lot of things. And what I remember is, like, when I told you you screwed something up, how did you hear that? How did you respond to that? And how did you try to make me whole after that? And I have really good examples, some related to gender and masculinity and my queerness, and some completely unrelated, right? And related to other things that happened. But at the end of the day, what I know is that my mom and my stepdad were products of their generation. They were products of the culture and community they lived in. And them ushering me to be like that boy's boy, that like masculine boy was what they had been taught, and them protecting me from harm and then loving me for who I was when I told them who I was is actually what mattered out of that, right? And so I don't know that that is helpful advice to the more technicalities of the question of wanting to do that, but I think to Adrien's point, like the difference is when a family member asks a highly gendered question of your 10-year-old and they respond, that you back up your 10-year-old to the rest of their family, right? But probably not that they see a picture of them in a pink frilly dress or, or a blue, boys baseball cap or whatever. That's probably not going to be nearly as influential to them as whether or not you were their parent, protector, and supporter when that shit got real, because it will at some point.
I also have to say that I do love it when people let this be funny a little bit too. I've seen some real funny things that people have done, like people come up, is it a boy or a girl? And we're like, hoping it's a human, or, thinking it's a T-Rex or whatever. There's lots of like people can sometimes just make that lighter, by joking around about it instead, it can keep it on the lighter side, which I think can be nice too. Species reveal party. I like sex reveal parties. Let's just go ahead and call it what it is, Let's get the decorations where we get them for bachelorette parties and just go ahead and have the party. Sex party, exactly. Baby sex party. I think it's gonna catch on, don't y'all? Yep.
I mean, any excuse for me to eat baked goods. I'm going to the party. I'm going. Does it is it really a gender reveal? Not really, but I'm gonna eat the cake. I would love it if we would stop burning down the forest with these things. We got to find a different way to reveal the whatever, right? But come on, a lot of this stuff, like Adrien and Marshall both said, a lot of this stuff feels really silly when you really break it down. And that's okay. We're humans. We can be silly. We can have fun, and we can be in community with each other as well.
I want to thank participants for sharing some questions. Thank you, Michael, for seeing that it was just to us, so giving some more context. So invite folks to continue to do that. I can't guarantee we'll get to everything, but really want to make sure that if there are participants with questions you want to ask, please go ahead and send those via chat to the panelists. I had a follow-up question, but before I do that, maybe pause, Carly, because I feel like I'm talking a lot and haven't checked in. So let me make sure I'm not steamrolling.
No, go for it. You're good.
Okay. One of the things I think I heard and I appreciate is how approaches have changed over time. So I'm wondering if we can do a little bit of time travel. I mean, we've asked about, your upbringing and what that felt like, and you experienced different things during different decades. We're in 2020s. So I just get curious, what's possible for parents in this decade, for the next couple decades, in terms of leaning into healthy masculinities, in terms of being queer and trans-affirming parents, given the societal time that we're living in.
And a simple way to a way to reframe that, sorry, Michael, that question is because a couple of you talked about the juxtaposition of different parenting experiences is what could your parents have done that they didn't? As just as another way to frame that question. Please, Michael, pass it.
I feel like my parents did a pretty good job of putting it out there for us. There were gender roles surrounding us, but in the house, everybody did everything. Everybody cooked, everyone cleaned, everyone took out the trash, everyone washed the dog. We did all the things. We learned all the things. And I have a lot of siblings. I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters. And my brothers know just as much about quote unquote domestic work as they do about anything else. And my sisters know just as much about like handiwork as they do anything else. So I think my parents did a really good job with that. And that's something that I'm trying to instill in my children, and in specifically my 4 godchildren who are at 13 down to 4. So it's like I'm starting all over again a little bit. And my goddaughter is like very stereotypically girl. And I'm like, take out the trash. And she's like, ew, that's, and I was like, did you put trash in there? If you did, you can take it out. And she's like, okay, right? So like she is very stereotypically girl, whatever that really means these days. But she loves the pink and the dresses and the this and the that. And she's still required to do the same things that her siblings do. And her siblings, like everybody has to do everything, and everyone is learning all of these different things and how they're not specifically for one type of person. And I think that's something that can really be continuing out even until today. And I see a lot of that happening. It's just, these are just chores. These are just things to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Michael. I had that same experience with, so my mom's family specifically were multi-generational ranchers, pretty conservative in lots of their values, right? Baptist church preacher was like I think my grandfather, my mom's dad, was the son of a preacher, but they were ranchers. And everybody had to do everything on a ranch. Like there are not enough people. And so I still to this day talk about my papa, who, as I'm thinking about it, really was that father figure of like healthy masculinity in a lot of ways that I often don't really super appreciate. But he was the cook. And like right now, I'm going home to visit my family this weekend. And the one thing I will do my best to do is keep my grandmother out of the kitchen because she can't cook to save her life. And we don't understand how she started eating how she kept eating when my grandfather passed away, right? But like he cooked. He rode on a horse, he was out gathering cattle, and he cooked on a campfire or came in early to make sure everybody was fed. And my mom grew up riding a horse and gathering cattle and hunting and doing everybody did everything. And so that work wasn't gendered in large part because when you don't have a giant family and you're not a big corporate ranch, that was how it had to happen. Everybody had to do everything to get it all done. And so I don't ever remember that sort of, I don't think that that's a thing that sort of shifted. I don't remember those sort of gendered constructs or ideas when it came to those, to those sorts of things. I remember being a kid being expected to be at the grill with the men cooking, which I still, have thoughts about what it means to stand at the grill and flip pieces of meat over. When I wanted to be in the kitchen with my mom and my aunts and my grandma cooking all of the other, the other things. But aside from those very specific sort of be with the boys, like, I was taught how to cook at a young age. I was taught how to do my laundry at a young age, right? Like everybody in my family was like, when you move away, you're going to be able to do everything. We will not assume that you're going to have a wife who can clean your clothes or make you dinner. Like you're not going to starve, because nobody in my mom's family ever had that experience of only knowing how to do the boys' things or the girls' things.
And to me, I think it's even bigger than the gender stuff. It's like we are, one of our stalwart parent volunteers at TGRC talks about us being a childist society. And I think that that's true. We don't treat children like they are human beings. We treat them like little extensions of ourselves. We treat them very much like property, I think, in sort of post-industrial culture. We still think of our kids as being our property, instead of thinking of them sort of going back to parent the child in front of you, that the children come who they are from the first moment. And we're often reluctant to recognize them and give them a safe container to just keep figuring out who they are, because we feel that we have to do all this control and restriction of their behavior, for all these myriad reasons. So for me, some of the people that helped me were certainly people in my own life, but like I loved Alfie Cohn's books, even just questioning things like competition itself, competition and reward itself, to me is a really healthy like start. Let's just think about our culture as a whole. And then for me, one of the things that helps trans kids the most is something I think we should do anyway, which is let kids say how they want to wear their hair. Let them say how they want to wear their clothes, you know, let them say what name they want to be called, even if it's not the name that we picked out for them. And with trans kiddos, there is no medical treatment that they can ask for. There's nothing medical that can happen for a little trans child. But a little trans child does want to be called by the right name and pronouns, may want to grow or cut their hair, may want to put on different clothes or engage in different activities. And to me, why would we ever say no to that anyway, whether the child's trans or not? If my kid came and said, I want to cut my hair real short, or I want to dye it pink, or I want to do this, it's like, well, okay. I mean, if you can't safely experiment with even something like your appearance while you're living at home with me, then how are you going to learn? You know, how can you learn your likes and dislikes and limits and all of that? So for me, like, let's just think about child rearing in general. And so much of what we've accepted as conventional wisdom, I think, is actually a little bit on the harmful side with kids and how we raise them. So to me, if I wanted to back up and just question everything I'd been taught, especially the stuff that I was taught was fundamental and necessary to raising a child, I just wanted to at least, it wasn't that I didn't come back to some of those things even, but for me to deconstruct it a little is important, because what we learn is often not really healthy. So we have to be willing to take it apart a little bit.
Thank you, Adrien and all. I'm really appreciating this conversation. Marshall, you got me like spinning into like another world of inquiry, actually, with like just talking about how like everybody did everything because there was a lack of specialization, right? Like you were contributing to an ecosystem, and it like I'm in this there's a psychic part of me that's in another world that's exploring how specialization contributes to gender norms. So that's like maybe a conversation for another day. And then Adrien, you're actually like, I was challenged by a podcast I was listening to this morning, and I shuffle through podcasts and I can't think of the creator at this time, but I'll try to share it and then follow up notes. And they were essentially talking about egalitarian parenting, and I found myself a little challenged by it, because I'm like, well, isn't some authority, like, what about, I've heard authoritarian versus like authoritative parenting, and so lean toward authoritative. But the frame was just that we don't, most parents, most adults do not treat the needs of children equal to our own needs. And like, that's really life-changing, actually, to think about, because one of the guest speaker at the end, she was like, the way that I was justifying authoritarian parenting, like all of the excuses I was using against implementing or like trying to lean into this idea of egalitarianism in the household, are the same things that I've heard to reinforce patriarchy and dominance of like men over women in more hyper patriarchal societies, more authoritarian societies. She specifically came from an authoritarian nation. So I just thought, I don't know, I'm like sitting with that, and then I'm listening to you, and there will be many, 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 many opportunities to unpack that. I have a question that's like just surfacing organically, just based on some of the conversation and then like the times that we're in, which is how would you respond as a parent? How would you respond to your child if they were experiencing bullying at school for their gender identity expression or their sexual orientation? Like, how do you meet them in a loving way, knowing that like you cannot always be there to protect them? What would you offer?
For me, I would want to connect with them and make sure that they knew that they were loved and being held up at home. I think when my child turned out to be someone who's on the more femme spectrum, who was designated male at birth, like my first response to that was to be terrified. Even as a trans person, 15 years into transition, when my kiddo wanted to walk out the door wearing more feminine clothes in a really obvious way, I have really had to bite my tongue until it bled almost to not be their first bully, to not be the first person to say, oh, hey, oh, do you think that's a good idea? And as parents, we're so afraid for our children. It is the deepest fear that we carry, I think, for many of us, that we think that way and we react to our fear instead of just what we're talking about, right? Like thinking about what is the need of the child to be accepted and loved and celebrated as they are, So I first just learned not to even say anything about what they were wearing or when they would go out or what they were doing, because I don't think that they don't know that, I think that they know that this world is not always tolerant of that kind of expression. They grew up with a trans advocate for a parent. They've heard those stories many times. And so I just wanted to say to them, you look so cute on the way out the door, instead of being like, oh my God, don't do it. It was a tough thing not to do that. So I think the first thing is to make sure that we're not engaging in it ourselves, or even subtly saying, hey, maybe this wouldn't happen if you weren't this way, or if you didn't do these things. I think that's one of the key crucial things we have to try to regulate ourselves about right off the bat. And then for me, I would have asked my child probably, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to come to school? Do you want me to help? Do you want me to talk to the teacher? Do you want your teacher to be helping you? I might have laid out some of the options as I saw them and said, do any of those sound like something that you might like for me to do to help you? And if they said, no, I'm going to handle it by myself, or I don't think I need your help, then that's also great. We want not to. When my child was in early childhood education, one of the instructors came running up as my ex tried to blow our kiddo's nose, and like it was almost like a martial arts movie, like came flying out of nowhere to snatch the Kleenex out of her hand and said, hey, every unnecessary help is a hurt. Right? Like if the child can do it and they want to do it, let them do it. And if they say, hey, come hold my hand, I don't feel like I can balance, then you go and hold their hand, So for me in a situation like this, is that same principle. It's like, let me say what I think we could do. Do you want help? And follow their lead in that way.
Just chiming in to be like, ditto. This happened with my oldest child, and asking my kiddo how we could be supportive, how their mom and I could be supportive was really key. And my son was like, oh, please don't come to school. Mostly because our kid knows us and we were coming to school. I was coming to school. He's like, oh my God, please don't embarrass me in that way. And us being supportive at home and having, supportive grandparents and other family members around turned out to be really great. And, then my kiddo ended up connecting us with another student, another one of their peers who needed some support. And we were able to help that kiddo's parents be supportive of their child. So yeah, it's hard, it's scary. And us not being our child's first bully or our child's primary bully is super important.
Michael, can I just follow up on that just for like a millisecond? Can you name, without obviously unnecessary disclosure, how did you support that parent's, like how would you approach a parent if you're an adult that a community member, a young person comes to, and their parents aren't quite on board? Like, is there an initial step? Is there an initial invitation? Do you have a little more to say there?
So the interesting thing is that our children were trying to date each other, which was already like putting everyone on edge. Like, oh no, keep your bodies to yourself, get away, like fire, emergency, no. But it just so happened that my child, who is cis, was looking to date their child, who was in the process of coming out to themselves and the people around them as trans mask. And my child was like being the advocate and like trying to teach the parents, like, this is what being trans is and blah, blah, blah. And my kiddo was getting really frustrated, and they're like, okay, Dad, you just have to help them because they're not understanding. And so part of it was them meeting an actual like realized adult trans mask person help to assuage some of their fears that I think most parents have whenever a child comes out. They go, oh my God, my child will be alone, my child will be hurt, my child will never have insert all of these other things here sort of deal. So them meeting me and being like, oh, you're like kind of boring, cool. And I'm like, thanks, I think. So them meeting me was one piece, but then also just sitting down and like answering their questions in a really non-judgmental sort of way, allowing them to ask like all of the things that they were terrified about with their child. I said, please ask me. Don't ask other random trans people that you just happen to meet, because I'm telling you I'm willing to answer your questions. And that ended up being really helpful for them. Our children did not end up dating. I was like, yes, I don't want my kids to date anyone ever if I can help it. I want their first date to be at my repass. That would be lovely. But it ended up working out where this other kiddo now had parents that were not fully on board, but at least could be respectful and not harmful to their own child.
Thank you so much. I want to give Marshall an opportunity to also respond.
I don't think I have anything to add, but I would just really highlight I think this is true across the board, which I think is the story Adrien was telling, but just ask your kid what they need from you. And I say this to people all the time. That's also what I need as an adult from my friends and from my romantic partner. And you're about to yell and scream for 45 minutes. Am I righteously angry and yelling with you? Am I calming you down and getting you to see the other side of things? Am I swinging hands on your behalf? What do you need from me in this moment? And I think all of us just need that. If I'm crying or screaming, your first question ought to be, what do you need from me in this moment? And I'll tell you, get in, we are driving out because we're all pissed. Or I need someone to break me out of this spiral of feeling badly about myself or whatever it is. But that's I don't have anything to add. I would just really highlight that. And I think it's good parenting advice, but also just in all of your relationships, ask your loved ones what they need from you.
Thank you, Marshall, for that wisdom. And maybe picking up on that thread, we are coming to a close of our time together. And so I want to give each panelist an opportunity to share some additional parting wisdom. Grateful for all the wisdom you've shared so far, for the robust conversation, and for the participants who've been able to join us. I'm wondering if we could do a lightning round, maybe 30 seconds each, to hear kind of your closing thoughts to this question. What parting wisdom would you like to give to parents hoping to raise their children in a way that lends to safe and equitable communities for people of all genders and all sexual orientations?
I will go first because I also have to jump really quickly, and I apologize for that. But I would say, have grace for yourself. If you are hoping to raise children in this way, you are already making the world a significantly better place than it was for some of us who grew up in a different time. So have grace for yourself.
And I would say, really make a proactive effort to make sure that your family is engaged in around all different kinds of people. I think it's really hard for kiddos to find themselves when they don't ever see anyone who is like themselves. So for me, we didn't use the word transgender in the 70s or even too much in the 80s here in the US. But if I had seen a trans person who was a trans masculine person, it would have saved me a lot of years of real struggle and heartache for sure. So to me, the more we can be around lots of diverse people, go to pride celebrations, go to lots of different cultural celebrations, be part of things in your community, be friends with different kinds of people, have folks in your home who are different kinds of people. That's the best thing that you can do for your child, to feel that the world is wide and diverse and that they can find their spot within that tapestry.
My parting wisdom would be that your child is beautifully and wonderfully made exactly the way that they are, right? So love your kid find ways to support your child, regardless of what potential hurdles they have to go through. The way that they are made is exactly the way that they're supposed to be.
Wonderful. I'm going to take that both of those with me for a long time. Thank you so much. Ian, do you have any last words?
Just another appreciation for the panelists. I know Marshall had to jump, but really, I'm very grateful to you, Adrien, and to you, Michael, for what you've shared, for the learning that you've given me today. I also thank you, Carly, for being a co-facilitator. This was our first of the parenting series, so we're working out what this is going to look like. And so really appreciate how you led and held space. And I also want to thank all of the participants. I know folks are busy. There's a lot of different things you can be doing. I hope you enjoyed some lunch while we were able to connect. And we're going to do some shameless plugs for some potential opportunities to reconnect here in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, so we have our next webinar. It's another lunchtime learning series at 11:45 a.m. on July 24th on anti-violent parenting and affirmative consent, with speakers joining us from Fathers New Mexico, the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, and Together for Brothers. We'll send everybody a follow-up who registered for this session. We'll have access to all of them. I just thoroughly enjoyed my time with everyone today. Michael, I feel like I get to know and see you a little better, so I'm grateful for that. Adrien, same. Marshall, I had never met Marshall before, so just deeply grateful for that. This is doubles as an opportunity to deepen relationship and connection in service of gender justice throughout our communities. And to Ian, wonderful co-host and facilitator, thank you. And yes, this will be on YouTube. It'll also be available at masculinitiesnm.org. And we will follow up with an email that has all of the links that were shared. Thanks, Adrien, for plugging some of those educational opportunities in. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.